Welcome to the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee's 8th meeting of 2020. Before we move to the first item on the agenda, can I remind everyone to switch off your mobile phones as they may affect the broadcasting system. We have some apologies from some members this morning. We've got apologies from Mark Ruskell, Stuart Stevenson and Finlay Carson. The first item on our agenda is to take evidence on the draft regulations providing a right to buy land for further sustainable development, and I'm pleased to welcome the Minister for Rural Affairs and the Natural Environment, Mairi Gougeon, and the Minister is joined by Fiona Harrison, who's the Deputy Director for Sustainable Land Use and Rural Policy, and Chris Byerley, the Land Reform Policy Officer. So good morning to you all. I believe you have an opening statement you'd like to make, Minister?
Yes, but before I do, it was just to advise as well, our SGLD representative, Julia, couldn't be with us this morning in light of the advice that was received last night. So if there are any technical or legal points, I believe that she is watching, and then we can take wait and give her a quick phone call if need be, but hopefully we'll be able to field most of the committee's questions today.
Okay, thank you.
Right, thank you. So, yeah, just to start, these regulations, if approved by the committee, are part of a package of instruments that will bring into force and implement Part 5 of the Land Reform Scotland Act 2016, the new right to buy to further sustainable development, and this will come into force on the 26th of April. It will give local place-based communities a new power to seek to acquire land to support sustainable development, benefit the local community and also the wider public interest. Where land is purchased, a community may also seek to acquire a tenant's interest in the land. Like Part 3 of the 2003 Land Reform Act, the community right to buy land that is abandoned, neglected or detrimental, when an application is successful, it is a compulsory purchase power. Unlike Part 3A, which is dependent on the state of the land, Part 5 is focused on the needs of the local community, whether they be economic, social or environmental. The sustainable development conditions against which an application will be assessed are fixed on the face of the 2016 Act. The affirmative regulations before you deal with certain matters about the implementation of Part 5, such as types of land to be excluded from Part 5, the definitions of community areas and the prohibition during the application process. The Scottish Government consultation on these regulations ran from the 26th of June 2019 to the 19th of September 2019, and this was largely a technical consultation focusing on bringing into force and implementing Part 5, and perhaps because of that there were only 20 responses to that consultation. The responses reflected a range of views on land reform issues, not all of them in agreement. However, we were pleased that for all but one of the questions, at least 50% of respondents supported the Scottish Government proposals. In making these regulations, which create a process by which a compulsory purchase power may be acquired by communities, we have at all times recognised the need to balance private and public interests. For example, there are important safeguards to protect from the right to buy processed land on which there is a home and land which is necessary for the life of the home in its fullest social as well as utilitarian sense. The regulations and the 2016 Act describe a process within which Scottish ministers can exercise a reasonable amount of discretion and in which all involved, whether landowner, community body, tenant or other party, can make their case. And I would finish by reiterating an important point made in the Cabinet Secretary's recent letter to the committee. In many areas, the regulations and issues raised by stakeholders are bound by the provisions of the Land Reform Scotland Act 2016, and in the case of land held by the Crown or a government department, the current devolution settlement. We simply do not have the legislative competence to amend them. They do, however, represent a full use of the powers we have available and will ensure that communities have another important tool at their disposal to unlock the full potential of the land that they live and work on.
Thank you very much. And you mentioned the letter that came from the Cabinet Secretary, which we found very helpful and comprehensive, answered quite a lot of our questions. Members will recall that we considered this instrument on the 3rd of March, and that's when we wrote to the Cabinet Secretary. And that response, a very full response, is included in the committee papers for anyone that wants to look at it. So we've got a couple of questions outstanding. These are all quite minor points, actually, Minister. I guess the first thing that we just want to look at is the concept of sustainable development. And I want to get your view on whether or not this is well understood and adequately defined. And looking forward to the guidance, do you think that that can be really nailed down and addressed in the guidance that goes out to people?
I suppose I would just start by saying that it's, as much as sustainable development itself hasn't been specifically elaborated on within this, it is still an understood term, and it's a term which has been used in previous pieces of legislation. So I do think that while it doesn't have that definition, it is something which is understood. And I would really, I suppose, echo the points that you'd heard in your previous evidence session. And I know that there were a few people there who had discussed the fact that it's probably more helpful to not have a specific definition of what sustainable development is, because in that sense you can box it in and exclude certain things that we wouldn't necessarily want to exclude. But that's what I would say, that we have experience in using that term from these other pieces of legislation, and that's why we wouldn't be, we don't really have any particular concerns about the way that it's expressed here.
I guess it's a case of, you know, we don't want to put people off from applying because they think that they won't conform to some kind of definition.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that would be the real fear, that you would exclude things that you necessarily wouldn't want to do. And I think that's where it's important that we look at each individual application as they come in, needs to be looked at on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, thank you. Claudia, you had some points.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Minister, and to those accompanying you. It was actually in reference to the defining of a community, which is always a challenge. And having been in the last Parliament and on the committee which had scrutiny of the Land Reform Act, it was indeed a challenge. However, I was, although I asked a question about communities of interest when we had the stakeholder session, I've reflected as much as I can on what was said in answer then, but also in the Cabinet Secretary's letter. And I think what she says under specified types of area for defining a community was very helpful. The definition of a community is one of a local place-based community. And then I also found it particularly heartening that the next sentence said, in many areas of Scotland, communities can have a deficit of power in relation to land. Now, I didn't find it heartening because they have the deficit of power, so we're absolutely clear, but that recognition of the challenge, and it's within that context that I'd like to ask you if you think that is the right decision, really, that it is only place-based.
I think so, but that's not to exclude. I mean, I think what's a positive part of the regulations that we have here as well is that there could be, say, a third party, which could be a business, it could be some other kind of organisation that could take forward this on behalf, could take forward the sustainable development on behalf of a local community. So I think that really covers all those areas, so that as much as communities can obviously take forward their sustainable development on their own behalf, that they also enable a third party to do that for them as well. So I think that we strike the right balance within these regulations.
Thank you.
Okay, Angus.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning, Minister. Can I firstly say that, like the Convener, I'm broadly content with the response to this committee's letter to the Cabinet Secretary, and it addressed a number of concerns that were raised in the evidence session earlier, earlier this month. But I was wondering if the Minister could tell us if the Scottish Government has a sufficiently rigorous and transparent process for assessing whether a community body's application will further sustainable development.
I believe that we do, and again I would just come back to the previous point that I made, that I do think the regulations strike the right balance here, because I do think if this was to proceed in a compulsory purchase and that right to buy, we want to make sure as far as we possibly can that process would be a success for that local community, and they would be able to deliver that sustainable development. So that's where I think that the tests that we have within that to assess that are quite rigorous in the regulations, because I think they need to be, but there are also a number of safeguards built into that process throughout it as well. So whether you're a landowner, a tenant, or the community themselves, there are numerous parts throughout that process where you can raise questions, or there's also numerous rights to appeal within that as well. So I think it sets out those tests which are clear and would have to be met for that to proceed, as well as having those safeguards too.
Okay, thank you.
Claudia.
Thank you, Convener. In the evidence session that we had, very recently, it was highlighted about community capacity can sometimes be an issue. And also the importance of taking control of land and other assets as a means of highlighting the possibility of jobs and housing and services in often remote rural areas. That was highlighted by Callum MacLeod of Community Land Scotland. So I'd like to ask you, Minister, if there'll be extensive guidance provided to communities and indeed to landowners in relation to application and execution of the right to buy process, because it's sometimes hard to, knowing some communities which have been through not this process, but it hasn't been passed yet, but processes in relation to land reform legislation, that it can be onerous and many are volunteers. So it'd be helpful to have a response to that.
Oh, absolutely, and that's where I think that it's important that people have support through that process as well. Sorry, Fiona, I don't know if you wanted to come in on that.
Yes, so the community land team, we will be developing guidance. I think if you look at the website, there is a lot of guidance for the existing rights to buy, and the team try to help people through the process, answering questions. There are, of course, organisations like Community Land Scotland as well. It is an onerous process because it is a compulsory purchase, but we do everything to try and support communities through that and help ensure that they're making strong applications and following all due process.
Right, thank you, that's helpful. And could you shed light on how the guidance will be developed and when it's likely to be available? Just to put you on the spot there.
Well, when is obviously other events may mean that things don't happen quite as quickly, but we are already thinking about the development. We will certainly be talking to people like Community Land Scotland to try, because it's in everybody's interest to try and make sure that the guidance meets their needs. I wouldn't like to commit to a date when the guidance will be online, given other things that are going on in the world. But we will be doing everything to try and ensure it's there as soon as possible.
Keep you updated on
Absolutely.
that as well as
Yes.
it progresses
Yes.
and as we move forward.
Yes.
Thank you. Unless anyone has any other questions they want to ask the Minister, we'll move on to the next item on the agenda. Next item is to invite the Minister to move motion S5M 20927 that the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee recommends that the right to buy land to further sustainable development, eligible land, specified types of area and restrictions on transfers, assignations and dealings, Scotland Regulations 2020 be approved.
Moved.
Thank you. Any other comments from members?
Just very briefly, Convener, I'd like to welcome this and say how important I think it is for our rural communities.
Thank you. So, for any other comments, I'm going to put the question to the motion. The question is that motion S5M 20927 in the name of Rosanna Cunningham be approved. Are we all agreed?
Agreed.
We agreed. Okay, we are agreed. Right, I'm going to suspend briefly to allow the Minister to leave. Thank you very much. Our third item today is to consider the negative instrument, the right to buy land to further sustainable development, applications, written requests, ballots and compensation Scotland regulations 2020. Do any members have any comments in relation to this instrument? No. Is the committee agreed it does not want to make any recommendations in relation to the instrument?
Agreed.
We're agreed. That concludes the committee's business in public today. We'll now move into private session, and I ask that the gallery be cleared as the public part of this meeting is now closed.